Hi, guys. Welcome to Real Food Recovery. We are on episode 56, and we have a very special guest today. It's Dr. Nicole Avena. But before we say hello to her, I must say hello to my partner, Jamie. How's it going?
Good, Paige. Glad to be here. So excited to have Dr. Avena here today. So, Dr. Avena, I just wanted to introduce you and tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what you do. Dr. Avena regularly appears on TV and radio and speaks at universities, government agencies, schools, and special interest groups about her research on food addiction and nutrition through the lifespan. She's appeared on the Dr. Oz Show and The Doctors and at numerous formal events around the country. Her wellness series talks are designed for non-scientist audiences interested in improving health and learning about the science to do so. Dr. Avena is a research neuroscientist, author, and expert in the fields of nutrition, diet, and addiction. She received a PhD in neuroscience and psychology from Princeton University, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship in molecular biology at the Rockefeller University in New York City. So glad to have you here, Dr. Avena.
Oh,
So
thanks so much. Happy to be here.
I have to tell you something funny. So I got your book, and I love these colors. It's the same colors as our website. So I think I was naturally drawn to it. But what you're going to laugh at this. I was engrossed by the forward. I just loved the forward of it. It was so it just pulled me in, and I loved your humor. There was a part in there where you were talking, this maybe wasn't in the forward, but you were talking about the sugar industry or the tobacco industry and how they
Mm.
sneak tobacco in, and how sugar does the same thing. And you're not going to find tobacco in yogurt, but you might, but you definitely will find sugar hidden in there. But one of the things that caught my attention in the forward is it said the term sugar addiction doesn't even appear in search databases until 2002. And decades of diet and obesity research was out there, and none of it even flirted with the using the term addiction. So I was just curious if you want to tell us a little bit about your academic life and how you got into this research. I thought that story was fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I've had an interesting, I guess, entry into this field. So I fortunately I have not struggled with a personal food addiction. I've been lucky in that I guess I've struggled with, the ups and downs that any woman in our society would have with respect to, body weight and that kind of thing. But for the most part, I've been blessed in the sense that I haven't had a personal experience with disordered eating or food addiction that I can identify with. But I got into this field because I was starting graduate school at Princeton, and I was literally like day one meeting with my advisor, talking about, what I might do for research for this huge research project that would be my dissertation. And it was interesting because the my advisor was had a neuroscience and psychology lab that was focused on motivated behaviors. And we started talking about how, back at the time, it was the year 2000, 2001, and the obesity crisis was really starting to get a lot of media attention. We were hearing more and more about the dangers of obesity. But back then, it was still thought of as being a moral failing. And people who were obese were thought to just not have the willpower, and they couldn't control themselves, and they should just go on a diet. And that was kind of the mantra at the time. And so we started to think about this, and, you know, we were saying that our food environment was changing at the same time. We were seeing more and more processed foods dominating the grocery store. And we started to think, what if our brains aren't designed to keep up with these processed foods and recognize them? And in many ways, when you look at the ingredients, the amounts of sugar, the flavorings, the amount of fat, like these foods are engineered to taste delicious. And
Mhm.
what if our brain reacts to that in the way that other people's brains react to drugs and alcohol? So, what if these processed foods could be addictive? Was really the question. And, I mentioned that in the book about how, it was a radical idea at that time because nobody was using the term addiction with obesity. And nobody was talking about the idea that food could be addictive. It was sort of this like foreign concept. And I still remember to this day, being a young grad student and going to like my first conferences and presenting my research and really getting a lot of pushback and negative feedback in the sense where people were like, what are you talking about? Food addiction. This is nuts. And so we did really have a lot of pushback initially looking at this, but we persevered and essentially developed a whole line of research that took us, it's still working on it, believe it or not. It's been over 20 years, but we're still doing studies in this area to really just characterize whether or not sugar in particular could meet the criteria for being an addictive substance. And we focus on sugar because it seems to be the primary ingredient in the processed foods that's driving people to overeat them.
Yes. Yes.
So that's really how I got here. It was really purely out of an interest in public health and also an interest in neuroscience and in what's happening in terms of, nutrition and how our body is reacting to our present food environment. But I'm really glad because I think that, the work that we've been doing and the research that we've been doing, it's really just validating things that people have been saying for years. And I've had many people over the years come to me and say, I was feeling like I was addicted. I knew I was addicted to those foods, and my doctor would laugh at me. And my family members thought, oh gosh, like give us a break. But it wasn't until they started to read about our research that now people can say, like, yes, there's a biological basis to this. It's real. Even though it's been real the whole time, now we have some science to convince people that it's real. And so I think that's been empowering for a lot of people.
Agreed. It certainly empowered me yeah, in every way, It was, I remember the day that I realized that it was an addiction. It was 2017. And I had, from my morbid obesity days, I was 400, probably about 450 pounds at my heaviest. Of course, I wasn't trying to find scales to weigh me. But by that point, I'd lost over 200 pounds without surgery, without pills. I had done it with really no support from the food industry research. I had done it with support from the American dietetics paradigm. And the paradigm was, hey, you've lost weight. You can go ahead. You can go ahead and have those foods again. You can go ahead and have that pizza. You can have that birthday cake on your birthday. You can have this and have that. You should be able to moderate it. And I couldn't moderate it. And I didn't understand why. So at that point, I'd gone through this massive transformation, but I was white knuckling. I was white knuckling and making my way through life. And I was just a rage-filled person because I didn't understand why I couldn't moderate these foods that I was told I should moderate. So I felt deeply broken. I felt deeply ashamed. And I felt like there was something from birth that was wrong with me. And when I understood addiction, at first I was like, whoa. Like I am many things, but I am not an addict. I never got into alcohol. I never got into drugs. I never got into that stuff. But when you actually look at the research and how the foods affect our brains and body chemistry, it was so clear to me. So before we jump into our discussion, I did want to read a quick overview of Dr. Avena's latest book called Sugar Less. And I want to remind listeners who might not have the book in front of them or the picture of the book in front of them, the cover, thank you, Paige, Sugar Less. The cover is 2 words, sugar less. Not one word, not hyphenated, sugar less. So that gives us a really good foundation of Dr. Avena's approach here. And the subtitle is Uncover Hidden Sugars, Curb Your Cravings, and Conquer Your Addiction. A science-backed step-by-step approach to break free from the cycle of addiction and outsmart a food industry that hides sugar in plain sight. Many people blame sugar cravings on a lack of willpower rather than acknowledging the fact that the substance is highly addictive, even more so than cocaine, nicotine, and alcohol. That is a bold phrase. In my experience, absolutely true. Absolutely true. And the problem isn't only dessert. Sugar is everywhere. Approximately 80% of products in supermarkets contain sugar. No wonder eliminating it feels impossible. The more added sugar a person eats, even unknowingly, the more likely they are to crave it. And Sugarless, Dr. Nicole Avena teaches you how you can completely change your mindset around what you eat. You will no longer use food to soothe or reward yourself or be a victim of the addiction machine that our modern food environment has created. She will show you how to break away and to use food for what it is intended to be, fuel for your body. I love it. Very cool. Very cool. We're going to jump into a lot of the content that was written above, but Paige, I want to turn it over to you for the
Yeah, so
question.
the first big question, well, first of all, thank you for the research you have done because it has changed people's lives. I mean, I remember being funny when I was just thinking in my earlier years, even my 20s and 30s, thinking, oh, I'm a sugar addict, just saying that in a silly way. But even though when the more I discovered, maybe I really am, I really didn't know what addiction was or what you were supposed to do with it or the science behind it. I didn't know anything of how to manage that. So one of the questions that crops up through this line of thinking are people helpless victims of their environment, or is it lack of willpower? Where do the addictions come from, and what's the problem here?
Yeah, so I think that where the addictions come from is an interesting place to start because we know there's a few different things that can contribute to an addiction. I mean, we now know that there is genetic vulnerability. There are some people that are literally just born being at higher risk due to their biological makeup.
Mhm.
Now, that could be because maybe they have parents who struggled with addiction. It could be just because they just happen to have that, genetic trait that happens to carry along with it that risk. And it doesn't mean that they're bound to become addicted to something. It just means that they have a higher risk.
Right.
And what ends up happening in many cases is that there is some sort of environmental influence that often can interact with that genetic predisposition that can basically turn the addiction on. And so in some cases, it could be a life change, a divorce, a major stress, or it could be a happy thing. It could be the birth of a child and the stress of, having a new responsibility. Could
Mhm.
be going to college for the first time. It could be a
Mhm.
variety of different things. But typically, there's something that happens that can really just sort of trigger this addiction into action. And that can, in many cases, slowly then build up into many of these behaviors that we tend to think about when we think about addictive behavior. So when we define addiction, we're very careful about it because addiction's a term that kind of gets tossed around a lot in our society. And so when we're doing our research studies, we make sure that we're using the American Psychiatric Association's definition for substance use disorder, which is essentially the closest thing we have to addiction. They don't use that word. And what we know from the American Psychiatric Association is that addiction actually falls on a spectrum. And so you can have pre addiction where you're maybe just at risk. You can be mildly addicted. You can be, majorly addicted. And where you fall on that spectrum is really going to depend on the criteria that you meet. And so some of the criteria include overconsumption, wanting to reduce your intake, but not being able to, failed attempts at being able to control how much you're consuming, spending an exorbitant amount of time or money or effort on thinking about the substance or using it or recovering from it, giving up other activities or failing to fulfill role obligations because of use. And I think the thing about food addiction that makes this really interesting is that a lot of what we know about addictive behavior, even based off of the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association criteria, is the fact that addiction is in many ways a social construct. And so, if it's illegal to smoke cigarettes on an airplane, then you're going to be identified as, addicted to smoking cigarettes if you're willing to smoke on an airplane and get hauled off the airplane because of it, right? Or if it's illegal to use cocaine and you use cocaine at a party, people are going to view you as, oh, they have a major problem. Like they're using this substance and it's illegal. It's interesting though, because sugar's not illegal. It's socially accepted. So we don't have those same social constructs around the use of sugar and processed foods. We've, in our society, normalized that behavior. And so what we end up happening is we have this very addictive substance basically just circulating around, and there's no social consequences linked to it. And so that's the thing I think about food and sugar that makes it really different in the sense that it's kind of spinning around this addiction definition, because if we take that social construct piece out and just look at the biology, just look at, okay, what happens in your brain when you overeat sugar? Well, it releases dopamine, it releases endogenous opioids, it causes changes in gene expression, all these things that happen when you use morphine, alcohol, nicotine, you name the drug. The same things are happening biologically. The same things are happening psychologically. We have the cravings, we have the guilt after we use it. We have that withdrawal syndrome that can emerge if we don't have access to it. We have physical effects of use, right? People who overeat sugar or processed foods, they can often have obesity, or they can be normal weight and maybe they're engaging in binge eating behavior. Um, so we have the biological, the psychological. The social piece is different though, right? Because we don't have the same social norms around food and sugar as we do around drugs and even alcohol to some degree. So that's what makes the addiction discussion a little bit challenging when we talk about food and how, sugar and processed food fits into that equation.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. And then you mentioned something about there's no social consequences linked to sugar. And I also would say there's no consequences linked to the sugar industry for the marketing of it and the production of it and the way that they fill the environment with it. There really are. There's no kinds of legislation around controlling the industry in making it everywhere, putting it everywhere around all of us.
Yeah, it's true. And the thing is, like I've been saying lately, with processed foods, I think we've just gone too far. I mean, there's nothing wrong with processing food. Like you peel a banana to eat it, you sear a steak. I mean, processing of food is part of the way in which we make sure that we eat food safely. And I think what's happened is that the food companies have just run away with that idea.
Yeah.
And now I don't even consider many of these foods processed. They're engineered. I mean,
Yeah,
they're
ultra
they're
processed, yeah.
literally like Frankenstein science experiments, so like that have been, combinations of ingredients put together that are beyond processed. And, there is no limits on how many sweeteners you can add, how much you can put as much sugar as you want in it, as long as you put on the nutrition facts label how much added sugar is in it.
Which no one has any idea what that really looks like. They see, oh, that's got 60 grams of sugar. Okay.
Right.
Like,
And, again, we also are under this false idea that if it's available in the grocery store, it must be safe and
Right.
healthy.
couldn't
And,
agree. Yeah.
I often will say, what else is safe? Or what else is in the grocery store? Bleach, but we're not drinking that. It's for cleaning. So it's
Exactly.
to kill the bad stuff. So again, I think that we've slowly gotten, I don't want to say brainwashed, but in many ways, we as a society, we've gotten fooled into
Bamboozled,
just
yes.
thinking that just because it's in the grocery store, it's okay to eat. And I think that the processing of our food has just gone way beyond what needs to be happening. I mean, when
Right.
we have the majority of the foods in the grocery store processed foods, what does that say about what we're eating and what we're putting in our bodies? We're mostly eating chemicals and, concoctions of things that are not natural to our bodies. And I think that that's where we're starting to really see a lot of issues with health complications that are emerging. When I take a
Yeah.
look at all the different preventable causes of death, and I teach a course on health psychology at Princeton. I just
Mhm.
wrapped up giving my first lecture, and I was going over what we were going to be talking about this semester. And, we talk about the preventable causes of death, and pretty much all of them can be linked back to our diet.
Absolutely.
And so we could put a dent in a lot of that death if we were to change our diet. Our diet contributes dramatically to the decrease in longevity that we're seeing, the decrease in how long people are living. And so I think when we start to think about that, it really can make a big difference.
I couldn't agree
Well,
more.
that's what I was thinking about when you were talking about social consequences. those are the social consequences, right? Just seeing our loved ones sick and miserable, not to mention the cost that, you know, of the medical system, and we can't keep going at this rate. So don't you think the high cost of people being ill is a social consequence?
I do, but I think that it's not acute. It's not something that we see happening overnight. Like you don't
Right.
get a
Right.
No,
heart attack
from
from
no
eating a
D.
cookie, right? It's
That's a good
over the
point.
course of many years
Right.
that the negative impact builds up. It's like tobacco. You know, people smoke cigarettes for years and years and years, and then they develop lung cancer, then they develop
Mhm.
heart disease,
Mhm.
and it's not an acute effect. Whereas, you know, I think like for instance, the traditional, drugs that are abused, like, for instance, heroin, let's use as an example. I mean, you can overdose on heroin and die from using that heroin.
Right.
And so that's this immediate thing that happens. And I think when people see that, not that we aren't taking it seriously, but you really get the message of like, wow, this is really, something that's bad for us. But if you look at the number of deaths from overdose on drugs compared to deaths that are cardiovascular disease, cancer related, heart
Diabetes,
disease,
complications.
related to diet, I mean, there's a lot more.
Yeah.
So I think it's something that it's just, the temporal scale that we're looking at. It's a long-term, silent, slow killer. Whereas, we're not going to see that immediate link. And I think that's where people have a hard time seeing that social consequence.
Yeah,
And
one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and you kind of covered it a little bit before about environmental influence, that the addiction can come out of an environmental influence, and then of course you could have the genetic predisposition to it. And where do you think childhood trauma comes in to, is that something where it could be that environmental influence?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we published a paper on this a few years back looking at ACEs scores.
Yeah.
Those are, acute childhood adverse experiences. Um, and, the potential vulnerability for food addiction and
Mhm.
addictions in general. And it's well known that individuals who have higher ACEs scores, and ACEs are, you could take a quiz online if you just Google
Adverse childhood
ACEs.
experiences.
Yeah, adverse childhood experiences. You can get a score of, based off of your history. It involves, lots of different aspects of, childhood life, whether or not you had abusive family, if you had somebody incarcerated in your family, if you had alcoholism in your family, homelessness, that kind of thing,
Mm.
even divorce.
Yeah.
And individuals who have higher ACEs scores are known to have poor health outcomes, both physically and in terms of their mental health.
Yes.
And when we take a look at food addiction, we see that there's a link to between higher ACEs scores and obesity, overeating, and disordered eating behavior, and food addiction too.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so I think that it's in many ways sort of like what happens with, other things where people have an adverse experience or a trauma, and sometimes that can be that trigger that we were talking about a few minutes ago that then can initiate this vulnerability where, as a coping mechanism, sometimes people turn to food as a way to self-soothe. We know that neurochemically the food can make you feel good, and if you're trying to battle an internal trauma that you're battling on your own, self-soothing or self-medicating with palatable food and processed food can certainly be one way to do that, especially if you're a child and that's what you
Right.
have
No one
access
was,
to.
no one was hit. My ACEs score, unfortunately, was very high. When I found out about the ACEs research, and I took the actual assessment, I was shocked to find how high it was, and how things that I thought were not these capital T traumas.
Right.
They were little constant traumas all throughout my childhood and adolescence. And when I got my ACEs score, I'm like, oh, well, you don't get to 450 pounds, you know, using food to essentially kill yourself. And I say this all the time, but at 4 years old, nobody's handing me a martini. but they're
Right.
handing me brownies and cake, and I sure found my way to get ease and comfort from brownies and cake. I mean, I was a little addict from before then.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I don't think it's uncommon in the sense that, you know, when children learn these coping behaviors early on, that's normal to them. And
Right.
so then they carry those behaviors with them through adulthood. And this is why when I talk about this to different groups, one of the things that I get a pushback on is, how I recommend people really, really work to moderate or restrict their kids' exposure to sugar. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, you're promoting an eating disorder then if you tell them they can't have it, or, that's not like, the best way to cope with it, because if the kids are healthy and they're normal weight, then why not let them have cakes and cookies and things like that? And I'm not saying they can never have any, but I am saying that, your child might be healthy right now in the sense that maybe, physically they don't have any issues, but they could have mental health issues that you're just not aware of that are brewing. And secondly, you're training them to eat these foods in a way that they're going to carry with them through adulthood. So, yeah, maybe when they're, 5, 6 years old, they can burn off all those calories and, they're not having any issues with it. But when they're 30 and they have type 2 diabetes because they're still eating the way they did when they were 5, but their body can't keep up with it anymore, then they're going to have a problem. And it's going to be difficult to break those habits that have been instilled since childhood.
Absolutely.
So that's where I think it's important for parents to be aware, this isn't about, trying to deprive your kid or make them not be able to enjoy things. That's certainly not the case. The goal is to make it so that they are healthy adults and that they don't have to face all these problems as adults that could be avoided by simply just, working to help them develop healthy eating patterns from an early age.
So true. Dr. Avena, one follow-up question, and then Paige, I promise I'll turn it over to you. The follow-up question to this is, we have members in our community, we lead a recovery community for folks that have addiction and obsession around processed foods. And we have many members that come to us that say, hey, my childhood was normal. And now when I hear that, I think there might be some undiscovered things from their childhood, that maybe they're suppressed memories and other things. Just from my own psychological education and background, I understand that those could be there. But these people are coming to us saying, I had a normal childhood. It was a happy childhood. Nothing major happened. Could their addiction be from cultural conditioning and repeated exposure over decades?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, we are able to see this in our animal models. So a lot of our early research was done in rats because we wanted to be able to see that exactly, right? Rats don't have, mommy and
Mommy
daddy
issues.
issues. They don't care what they look like, but they, allow us to see what happens if you condition something over and over again, if you allow exposure to something over and over and over again. And that's what we've been able to see. So I think that that's what makes this so dangerous, is that, yes, individuals with higher ACEs scores or trauma are at higher risk for food addiction. Individuals who have a genetic vulnerability are higher risk for food addiction. And then everybody else is at higher risk for food addiction just because of the environment that we live in, this food
Right.
centric, sugar centric society that really promotes and normalizes these behaviors. So, that's why I think it's such an important topic for everybody to listen to and hear about, because everybody's at risk. And even if you think that you have a really good handle on what you eat and you think that you have it under control, the reality is our food environment is changing every single day. And we're seeing less and less emphasis on people cooking food and making their own food, and more emphasis on processed food, fast food, convenience. And that messaging continues to just permeate. And, it's something that can wear people down. And I think that's what contributes to a lot of people's struggling.
Well, that's with me because when I started into the recovery, trying to get off sugar, and a lot of people were saying that their addiction came from maybe a childhood trauma or some event. I'm like, I didn't really have that, but I just was exposed to it from my earliest memory. I mean, that's how we celebrated birthdays. That's how we celebrated every holiday. Every Sunday after, church, after the big Sunday meal was followed immediately by a dessert. So after time, I'm just like, hey man, I like this. Give me more. I don't understand what's happening, but I know I can't wait to get it again. From my earliest memory, I don't ever remember not thinking that. Even as a small, young, spindly kid, I wanted a second piece of cake or a second piece of cookie, but I was so hyperactive that it really didn't matter until, start going through menopause or something like that. And then things shift and you start paying attention. So I'm glad you answered that question clearly, that it doesn't always just have to be trauma or even predisposition, but just repeated exposure. I don't know how you escape it.
Yeah, it's true. That's what I think makes it so difficult for people who even recognize, yes, I'm addicted. I have to get away from this. It's really difficult to, right? Because it's everywhere. It's so pervasive. And, people who struggle with alcoholism or people who are addicted to drugs, they're a little luckier in some sense
Right.
because at least they know where the drugs are and they know where the alcohol is because, you can avoid, restaurants that have bars. You can not keep alcohol in your house. Don't go to the grocery stores where alcohol is in the aisles, that kind of thing. But I mean, you can't really do that with sugar. It's hidden. I mean, and could you imagine if, there was like heroin hidden in our hamburger buns and, I mean, it
Probably
would
sell
be,
more hamburger buns.
yeah, we probably would, but it would be a terrible thing. I mean, to
Right.
not know where these drugs are and to have to
Right.
discover after you've already consumed it, oh my gosh, I just found out there's a ton of sugar in there.
Yeah.
That's what happens to people. That's why when I talk in my book Sugarless about how to kind of break through this, I don't really advocate a cold turkey approach because I find that for some people that works and they can do it. But I think that a lot of other people have tried that over and over and over and over again over many years, and it ends up being cyclical failure and guilt that they get from that, from not being able to succeed at the cold turkey approach. So I do talk more about a harm reduction approach. And, like Jamie said, the title of the book is Sugar Less. And it really is about working to reduce our dependence on added sugar.
Mhm.
And, that for some people can come easier than others. And that's why, the design of the program is really to help people to be able to do it at their own pace in the sense that you're not like failing the plan ever because there's no way to fail it. Because if you have a slip up or a setback and you maybe eat something that you regret later, that's part of the plan. That's part of the journey. Is those mistakes are now part of what we're using to learn from so that we won't do that again if it were to happen. And so, I think that that's something that makes this unique, is that it's more forgiving than a lot of traditional advice that's out there. And I think we need to be that way because, again, if you found out, like, oh, here, this salad that I ate that I thought was super duper healthy, I just found out when I looked at the bottle of salad dressing that there's, 30 grams of sugar in it. And now what?
Right.
So I think that having an approach where we can really work to minimize our exposure, identify it, replace it, and just bring it down to the lowest level possible is a strategy that can help a lot of people and
Growth mindset,
can
growth
get
mindset.
away from that all or nothing approach.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you find that having a little bit of sugar in their diet, though, still keeps the cravings alive, or how do you address that
Well,
point?
what I recommend is thinking about when it comes to cravings, not giving into those cravings with the things that we traditionally would give in. So if you're craving a cookie, you don't go eat a cookie. You
Right.
have a piece of fruit. And so you're still able to, yes, have some sugar and maybe satisfy that sweet craving, but you're doing it in a way that is going to provide you with fiber, it's going to provide you with other nutrients, and you're breaking that association because if you're craving a cookie, then that's actually a hedonic response. You're craving the pleasure that you get from that
That's right.
cookie.
That's right.
So you should be able, if you're craving the sugar, you should be able to be satisfied by having some grapes or having, a peach or something that's going to have sugar in it. And
Works
so
every
that's,
time.
yeah, that's what I recommend is, focusing on satisfying those cravings with appropriate foods to satisfy those cravings.
Yeah. And that's why I really like that, your book so eloquently lays out the problem, but we live in the solution. Paige and I want to live in the solution, and I know you do too. So tell us more. You've already given us one of your recommendations. Tell us more about your recommendations. Are they for tried and true sugar addicts, like me, maybe like Paige, or are these recommendations just for those looking to moderate? And the reason I ask that is, for me, um, even fruit is not a gateway. Fruit is the end for me. When I have fruit, I really cannot eat more than 2 pieces of fruit after a meal. I just can't do it. It's never something that there's no pineapple anonymous. It just
Right.
doesn't exist. So for me, it's okay. Fruit is the be all end all of a cravings ender. However, and I don't want to let my cravings control me. I'm very clear now when I have a craving, okay, that's my amygdala, it's my addictive voice, that my blood flow is in my midbrain. I've got to bring it to my frontal lobe. But I understand that the brain science behind that now, and I do things to bring my blood flow back. But for those that don't, and for those that don't understand how a little bit of sugar, one cookie could really open the gateway to multiple cookies or a sleeve of cookies down the road or whatever. What are your recommendations? How do they align to that?
Yeah, so I really focus on taking baby steps. And I
Yeah.
think that one of the things people really need to focus on first is, first of all, admitting that they're addicted and admitting that, again, addiction is a spectrum. You can be a little bit addicted or you could be really, really, majorly addicted. And that's why I think this book appeals to so many people, because you can fall on anywhere along that spectrum and the book is going to benefit you. And
Mhm.
so, people who are maybe mildly addicted are going to be able to then get the control back. That's really the goal, is getting the control back. And like you were just saying, Jamie, about you don't want your cravings to control you. You want to control. You're the boss.
Right.
And I think that's what the goal of the book is to put people back in the driver's seat so that they're in control of what they eat. It's not about never eating sugar again, because I don't think that that's realistic. And I think that when we sort of make those generalized statements, that opens up people, to then say things like, oh, well, then I shouldn't eat sugar because, or excuse me, I shouldn't eat fruit because it has sugar in it.
Right. Right. It's
And
general
again,
phrase.
I think for most people, they're not struggling with apples being their substance of abuse. It's, you know, cakes and cookies and these highly processed foods that are engineered to be very different than, apples are. So admitting that you have an addiction, understanding the component of how addiction works and how these foods activate the brain. And I cover all this in the book, but I cover it in a way that I've been told is very friendly, in the sense that it's not like this scary sciencey
Yeah.
stuff, because a
I
lot of people, get a little bit intimidated by the science. I try to break it down in a way that is understandable, but everyone's intelligent and they should know about this stuff, because this is what's happening in your body, right?
agreed.
And so figuring out, the addiction piece and understanding that, and then from there going on to identifying the hidden sugars. Where are they? And a lot of us don't realize that our yogurt is loaded with added sugar, or that those English muffins that you bought at the store have added sugar in them.
And
So,
marketed as health foods, right? Yogurt's often marketed as a health food, and so many health foods are
Mhm.
marketed foods are marketed as health foods, and they're filled with sugar. They're filled with chemicals.
You've got to read the
absolutely,
labels. So
absolutely.
people that are heavy on the addiction spectrum that you work with versus very mildly, do you give different advice then if people are very, very addicted? As far as you had said, you can never have cake again, but people that are heavily addicted, do you still say that?
Well, again, it's about the control. And so people who are in the throes of it, very heavily addicted, if they feel like they can't have a cookie because they know from experience that that is going to set them down this path of just binging and overeating, then yeah, you can't have a cookie
Yeah.
because you are not in control.
That's right.
But I'm not saying never in your life again at your 90th birthday party are you going to not have any cake.
Okay.
No. At your granddaughter's wedding, no. I'm saying that by then you'll hopefully be in control. And so that's really to me what it's about. It's not about saying no, never, but it's again, it's a journey of getting the control back. And one of the things that I think a lot of people, and perhaps both of you can resonate with this, is that once you have the control back, even though you have the control, you don't want to eat that stuff.
Totally.
I would
It's
agree. And
scary.
my experience with that is I agree 100% in theory. In practice, and I'm 15 plus years into recovery, from weight loss recovery as well as addiction recovery, in the last since 2017. And I had a relapse over the holidays where I was around food I hadn't been around in 3 years. And I found myself eating the brownie, eating the cookie here, the piece of this, that, or that flour laden thing there. And I ended up continuing those choices over several days. It wasn't a huge binging or anything like that, but it was like, oh, I'm just going to have a little piece of this today, and then tomorrow I'll have a little piece of that, and then pretty soon it was, I'm going to have these gluten-free pancakes, and it was several days in a row. And my brain started to create schemes, and it started to create all of these things about, well, we could just have this binge. We could go out and get all of that food we haven't had in those many, many years, and we can go out and get it again. Now, I know that I'm on the extreme side of this spectrum, but I want to be careful that we tell people that, oh, someday you'll be able to have it, because that someday came for me. I had it, and it ignited my addiction again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think this is what speaks to the fact that there are so many nuances to this, and that's why it has to be personalized.
Yeah.
And the fact that you're able to, recognize, and I think that's another thing in the book that I really try to hone in on, is being in touch with your response to these foods. And
Yeah.
like you were saying about how you start to come up with these schemes and these like scenarios, and if you're doing that, then you're not in control. You're not in control.
Good point.
So, and again, I think that there are people, just like there are people who are addicted to alcohol and they can't ever have it in moderation. They just can't.
Right.
I think that's a certain group of people. And then the safest thing for them is to just avoid alcohol. And I think that there are people who it's the same with food. Do I think everybody is like that? No. I think that there are degrees of this addiction. And I think that for a lot of people, it comes down to the fact that they're addicted and they're not even aware they're addicted, because it's become so pervasive and so commonplace in our society to eat this way. It's only when they really start to think about it and look at what they're eating and look at how they feel that, they have that aha moment and they're able to say, wow, if I change the way I eat and I stop eating these things and cut back, I'm going to really see a big difference. And that's what ends up happening.
Yeah.
I was fascinated. You touched on food deserts in the book, and I'm fascinated by that subject. Do you just want to take 1 minute, and what is your solution to food deserts for people that are struggling with addiction and wanting to, better their health? Do you have any piece of advice?
Yeah, I talk about this in the book because I think it's so important that we understand that, a lot of Americans, millions of Americans live in what's known as food deserts, which are basically areas of the country where they don't have access to a proper grocery store. They're
Mhm.
doing their grocery shopping at a corner market, or, a place that has a very limited supply of different types of products. And I think that often it's the case, and we know this from the research, that individuals who are shopping that way are often the individuals who have greater rates of obesity, greater health complications, more poverty. And so it can be extremely difficult, if you're trying to eat healthy, but you're shopping at a store that only has 3 or 4 healthy things in it, right? And the majority of the food that's available to you is processed food. So, what can you do? And I think that that's a real challenge for a lot of people. It's a societal problem that we need to really work harder to address. But I think we need to recognize that it is an issue, and that, having access to healthy foods is really something that a lot of people don't have. And so that's where I think the whole willpower piece and the, moderation, again, that comes up, because if you're telling someone that they should, just have the willpower when they don't have access to the foods that would help them have the willpower, then where does that leave people?
Very true. Very, very true. This is something that's so interesting to me because I've said this to Paige many times and to other folks we've talked to and coach, that I believe I came out of the womb an addict, sugar addicted. And how do you, and I know that even though I was breastfed, and I was not supplemented with formula, I breastfed so much, so vigorously, that my mom had to actually wear different clothing so that I couldn't just climb under her shirt and latch on. So that's the intervention that her pediatrician came up with when I was still, I mean, I'm guessing barely a toddler, that I was, able to do that. So, and I have photos of me, under a year old, obese already. So how do you work with pregnant moms who want to make sure that their babies don't end up with some kind of addiction that they could have potentially been giving them while they were gestating?
Well, I think that it's a point that we need to focus on more in terms of educating people and working with pregnant women. And I've been doing a lot of work in this space. I have another book that I wrote that came out a few years ago called What to Eat When You're Pregnant.
Oh,
And the reason I wrote the book was because I myself became pregnant with my first daughter, and I thought, oh wow, I'll be great at this. I know what to eat. I study this for a living.
Sure.
And I was really just shocked, though, when I went to the doctor, about how little emphasis there was on healthy eating. I felt like I was at a cattle show. Like, they would say, get on the scale and write down your weight. And there was no like, oh, what are you eating for breakfast? Or what kinds of foods do you like to snack on? Nothing about that. And I thought, wow, there's like a real missed opportunity here, because a
Mhm.
lot of people view pregnancy as a time when you shouldn't be dieting. And I certainly don't advocate that a pregnant woman would go on a diet, but I do recommend that pregnant women try to eat super duper healthy. I mean, I have friends who won't get their hair dyed when they're pregnant, but they'll still get
Eat
chicken
McDonald's.
nuggets at McDonald's. So, I mean, there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So the reason I wrote the book was to capitalize on the fact that you could eat healthy foods during a pregnancy, and you could see how these would benefit the baby, week
Mhm.
by week steps on, if you eat these foods or focus on these foods, these healthy foods, introduce them, because this is a time during which, your eyes are developing for the baby. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on, foods that are going to support that. And it's really kind of a fun way to basically just build in eating healthy foods and getting away from the convenience and the junk foods, because we talk about environmental toxins. I mean, the biggest environmental toxin that you can give your growing baby is to feed it a whole bunch of processed food. And
Absolutely.
so helping women to kind of work through that and see that, but with the reality lens on, that, look, hey, I've been pregnant. I know what it's like. You're going to have those days where you're just like, I need something. And, helping people to kind of see how you could navigate through that space, but on the other side of it, come out feeling good about the fact that you're doing what you can to, eat the right foods and promote a healthy diet for your pregnancy and also for your soon to be baby.
So true. Thank you.
I think we probably just have time for just the last question. Jamie, do you want to ask it, or do you want me to go for it?
Go for it.
Okay, so in summing all of this up, and this has been great. We have so much more. We could just talk for another hour. But what's your most important piece of advice for those in recovery and wanting to break up with their sugar habit? What would you tell
So
someone?
my most important piece of advice, I think, would have to be to take small steps. Every step you take, even if it's an inch, it's still a step in the right direction. And you have to look at this as a journey and not as some sprint that, you're the first one to the finish line, because it's going to be something that you want to sustain. You don't want to, you
Yeah.
know, that's why the whole diet culture, I think, has really just psychologically destroyed a lot of us, in the sense that,
Ooh.
it's the 30-day or the 60-day or whatever. They put this like
Black, white,
time.
good, bad. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not like that. It's not supposed to be like that. We're talking about, you know, what you're using to sustain your body, the food, the fuel you're giving yourself. So small steps, and I think that we have to get away from this, culture of punishing ourselves if we don't do it right, or if we don't follow the rules. And that's why it's a really, again, about the journey and about making better choices, and really just working toward making better choices more often and more often and more often. And then eventually you're making really good choices all the time, but it's going to take time.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that people need to come to terms with, because that's what's going to work. That's not something that is going to be a fleeting effect. You're retraining your brain to eat
Exactly.
healthy foods, to break up with your dependence on these processed foods. And it's unfortunately not going to happen overnight, but when it does happen, it can sustain itself.
Yeah, it's like I tell clients all the time, you've got these snowblower tracks in your brain that are grooved, deeply grooved, depending on how long, towards these processed foods, towards these sugar laden foods. Now you have the opportunity to create a new snowblower track, a new neural pathway in your brain. And where are you putting your energy? Are you putting it toward that old deep track, or are you putting it toward that brand new one that you wanna create in your neural firings? So it's an opportunity, and we have a choice every time. We have a choice. Old pathway, new pathway, every
Right.
time. It really is in our control. One, I just want to confirm, and I'll make sure that we add these to the show notes, Dr. Avena, where viewers or listeners can find you, and any other content you want us to make sure that we include.
Yeah, so you can find me at my website. It's drnicoleavena.com. You can also find me on social media at Dr. Nicole Avena. And the book Sugarless is available wherever books are sold. You can find it at Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, your local bookstore. You also can find it on my website. There's links there for people who are interested in buying a signed copy, and also links to my other books as well. And yeah, definitely check out the website and the social media feeds if you're interested in learning more about the latest research and just, the different topics around this. I like to put out content related to this because I think that it's always changing and there's always something new coming up. And so the goal is to really help people just stay informed and learn so that they can make better choices.
And I'm going to say something. Your book is an easy read. It's not scary. It's not science scary at all. It's very easy and enjoyable. You use humor. I enjoyed it very, very much.
Very approachable.
Oh,
Yeah,
good. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
thank you. So thanks guys for being with us. If you want to know more about us, you can find us at realfoodrecovery4u.com. That's the number 4, the letter U, and we hope to see you there. Thanks guys. Bye-bye.